Now, back in the old days, there used to be this one prevailing ideology in the world of motorsport. It was race on Sunday and sell on Monday. But considering that in the modern times, how many cars would you think that Ferrari would sell in the world of Formula One, or just around the world, in fact, this whole weekend after what's happened in Azerbaijan? Think about that. But that's not the major question that we're going to answer this weekend on the Inside Line F1 podcast, because there's so much of other stuff to talk about, including who do we think would have won this race, and why did Sergio Perez not end up winning this one? Because he was the one who had the track position beforehand, didn't he? So more on that, more on Mercedes and porpoising and what exactly is going on. Who are our 8 sleep performers of the weekend? And also, we have a special stats review segment from F1 Stats Guru coming up right here on the Azerbaijan GP review on the Inside Line F1 podcast and Pitch the Podium. Let's begin. Hey folks, welcome back in. My name is Soumil. I am joined by Kunal Shah, the former marketing head of the Force India F1 team. Baku, Kunal, Baku. That's all I have to say. I love this place. It just ends up producing so much of drama at all times. And I suppose it has created another sense of drama in the Ferrari boardroom right now, because how do you even handle a situation like this?
Firstly, I have to ask you, is it really well done, Baku? Let's go ahead and rate the race, Sommel.
There we are. I knew this was coming at some point, but no, to be honest, a solid 7 in my opinion. It could have done more. We could have had some more drama towards the end. It would have, of course, been lovely to see Charles Leclerc competing, and we shall discuss more on what would have happened had he not DNF'd. But yeah, 7 for me, pretty much decent in a way. It's not a boring way to spend 2 hours. But what would you rank it as?
Well, I would rank it as a low 3 or just about reaching a 4 because, there was a race with no red flags. Bernd Maylander, the driver who would have, who normally, participates in the race in Baku with an 80% probability. That's how high the safety car probability was. There was no safety car. And of course, I don't mean to say that we need safety cars to sort of add things to the mix and make it more entertaining. But to me, it just seemed that the race was, lacking a little bit. And then, of course, lacking a lot after the Ferraris had disappeared from the scene. I mean, there was one point of time where GP and Max Verstappen were discussing things like, okay, maybe you shouldn't use the DRS, and okay, Max, maybe you should drive. Let's discuss how slow can we drive and still win the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, right? And there is an old saying in the world of motorsport, and I love it. It's like winning the race at the slowest possible pace, and that's what Max Verstappen did with his teammate Sergio Perez in number 2 at the race yesterday, Samuel. So that's where my rating also stands.
Yeah, but critically, he was slow but not slow enough, because he ended up passing Sergio Perez. And we shall come to Ferrari in a minute, Canal, but it's a very interesting question that's just bobbling around in my mind about why did Sergio Perez not end up winning this race? And believe it or not, from all the reports that are coming out, from all the journalists and from all the experts of sorts in the world, everyone is saying, or rather at least inclining towards the fact that Sergio Perez cooked up his tires. Sergio Perez of all people. That this is bonkers the way that's happening. Would you kind of say that this is something that really happened, because his pace in the second half of the race really seemed to dip down badly?
I would say that's exactly what happened. Firstly, the VSC that was deployed, he wanted to pit in the VSC. Red Bull wanted him to pit in the first VSC, all right? But what happened is the message to him came a second too late. He had already crossed the pit entry lane, so then he couldn't end up coming. And he actually said post race that it was a miscommunication why we actually did not pit under the VSC, right? So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened, Sommel, was that he actually ran at a very, very fast pace in the opening laps because he wanted to break away from Charles's DRS. So I think by the fourth lap or something, he was 2 point something seconds ahead. So he really built up that gap. And then when that VSC happened, he cooled his tires down a little too much, which is why he ended up not having the tires when he needed to have them, and which is where the pace drop came in, and which is also where Red Bull, chose to just go ahead and win the race with Max Verstappen, because they said we're going to have have a 1-2 race finish, especially at a time when Ferrari are not finishing. And of course, Verstappen being ahead of Perez is great for the championship, especially with the whole number one, number two driver thing, at least at the Red Bull end. But that's pretty much what happened with Checo Perez. And mind you, he actually snatched the race lead from Charles Leclerc right at the very beginning of the race. I think he made a fantastic start to take the lead.
I think it's probably the first time that I ever saw Sergio Perez leading lap one of a race. I was like, hey, Checo, come on, let's do this. But by the time we came to the middle of the race, that kind of faded out. And of course, there's a sense of excitement attached to Checo because he doesn't win that much. It's not that I don't like Max Verstappen, but yeah, the point is, there was a certain novelty around it that suddenly faded away. But I was wondering at some point, and this discussion actually popped up between myself and my dad, because both of Sergio Perez's stops, again, 2 seconds longer than what they were ideally meant to be. Perez at the end also was told no fighting. Now, on plain observation, that might look like team orders, but there was more to it, Kunal, because as we discussed, his pace was certainly being compromised. And had, let's say, Leclerc been there on track, it would have been better to have someone shielding off because Perez at the end, his performance dropped off badly. He was, what, 17 seconds off at the end or something?
Yes, he did. And after a point, they were just cruising around, bringing their cars home. And we should also discuss why Perez wanted to pit under the VSC, why the Ferraris actually pit under the VSC, because what the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, what was happening at that point of time when the VSC happened is suddenly we had the top two teams using different race strategies to try and win the race. Red Bull choosing to not pit under the VSC, whereas Ferrari choosing to pit under the VSC. So clearly it was like, okay, which strategy is eventually going to give the race win? And pitting under the VSC would have meant saving 10 seconds of stoppage time, which in Formula One terms is extremely high. And that's what Charles Leclerc wanted to do. Charles Leclerc did do and Perez wanted to do. Now, this is also probably a good place to ask why Max Verstappen actually didn't end up pitting under the VSC, because Max was trying to attack Charles in the opening stages of the race, but he was not able to make a move uh, despite the Red Bull having higher speeds at the end of that massive long straight, Sommel, right? So had Max also pitted under the VSC behind Charles Leclerc, there's a good chance he would have just been chasing Leclerc eventually throughout the whole race and not been able to make that move, right? Which is why Red Bull actually told Max to do the opposite of what Charles did, to try and give him a tire offset, to try and give him a different strategy to jump Charles Leclerc. Now, of course, by the end of it all, by the end of lap 20, it didn't really matter what strategy Red Bull was on and what strategy Ferrari employed, because we literally did not have a race at our hands. And for once, it seemed like Ferrari did make the right call, bringing Charles in, at the first VSC. Although, Soumil, I think maybe you have a different view on that, don't you?
Yeah, did they? Because when you judge how the other drivers around Charles Leclerc performed, I mean, drivers who also had a similar strategy per se, it seems hard to really tell that if he would have won the race. Again, it would have been better if we saw this on track. It's, of course, not as objective to speculate, but hear me out for a second because Pierre Gasly also pitted at the same time. We also had Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, Sebastian Vettel, everyone boxed at a similar point of time. And everyone go on from the mediums onto the hard compound tires, like Charles Leclerc on lap number 9. But the interesting part about that is the runners who eventually pitted under the second VSC, they had a better time off, like Russell, like Hamilton. They were able to get past the likes of Gasly and Vettel. Of course, Vettel's spin did not help out, but you get the idea, right? Later on, the hard compound was better. Now, the interesting part is Leclerc, now Red Bull Racing actually, they had two sets of hard compounds and one medium. Ferrari had the opposite, one set of hard compounds and two set of medium. So if Leclerc would have pitted at the second VSC, assuming that he was on track, he would have come out with the medium compound tires at the end. And now, theoretically, that sounds like fun, right? Softer compounds, less laps to go, final part of the race. This is when he can attack, but if you take a look at what happened to Daniel Ricciardo at the end, he also went to the medium compounds at the very end of the race. and struggled with terrible degradation. And his engineer also came on the radio and said, "It's not just you, Daniel. We've got a couple of cars around us who also struggled with bad degradation on the mediums towards the end of the race." So this just makes me wonder, Leclerc on the softer compounds at the end, would he really have been as effective? Of course, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it would have been better to see it on the track, but it seems like not quite, especially when you consider that the Ferrari didn't really have the pace advantage in the race per se in the period that we saw actually as well.
That's actually very well explained, Samuel. Thank you very much. It was just how we dissect, tire strategy when it comes to different strategies that teams end up using for a race. And it must also be, pointed out that lap 9 was actually not very early to switch onto the harder compound, because the harder compound was actually the preferred race tire, right? And even though it was literally halfway through the actual gap of what actual ideal lap when teams would have ideally liked to pit. So to me, Ferrari did call it right, but yes, maybe they did not have enough number of hard compound tires, right? Just to make that strategy work after the second VSC.
Yeah, and on this point as well, because let's say Leclerc did what, say, someone like Pierre Gasly would have done. Let's say he stayed on the hard compound tires and made those tires last for the entire race. Gasly at the end was, I wouldn't say struggling, but definitely you could see a pace difference. So with Leclerc, it's hard to tell if he would have been able to keep Verstappen and Perez behind. But I suppose that's all just theoretical stuff, right? We can all just speculate on that at this particular moment in time. What's the bigger point is, what would have happened if Ferrari had they not DNF'd? And yeah, why did they DNF in the first place?
To just extrapolate a little further from what you said, Samuel, right? That maybe Ferrari would have just stayed onto the hard, but this also allows them to sort of turn around and say that at the end of the day, maybe Red Bull could have also just stayed out, or since they had enough of a gap on the Mercedeses, made a second stop and gone a lot more aggressive in terms of chasing Leclerc. But guys, that's exactly where we are right now. We don't know how this race would have sort of transpired. And definitely, it was a race that I feel we were all terribly robbed, because, hey, when was the last time that we actually saw Charles versus Max battling for the lead of the race? And of course, Checo Perez in the mix as well. Because you remember the season started off with all those battles, and then suddenly we've literally had nothing. First Ferrari ran away, then Red Bull ran away, and then Ferrari have had problems in Spain. And come to think of it, Sommel, Ferrari have literally cost Charles 3 back-to-back race wins. At least that's what one would have assumed. We saw Spain, we saw Monaco, and then assuming whichever driver would have won in Baku, possibly three race wins, or at least I'll be correct in saying Azerbaijan, because he did retire from the lead of the race. So at least at that point he was sort of the race winner.
Yeah, I've been hearing this this opinion on the internet that Ferrari is just like a midfield team who's been given a great car. Well, I don't think you can say the same right now, because it's the car that's been backfiring over the last three races. One-time strategy, yes, but yeah, terrible how it's playing out. But what's actually running in my mind, Kunal, is that we saw out of the five DNFs, DNFers, can you call them that? DNFers? That's a fun term. But out of the five people who DNF'd, four of them had Ferrari power units. Now, Sainz apparently had something to do with his hydraulics, but you see a common link between Leclerc's DNF, Magnussen's DNF, and on all the others that also happened. Zhou Guan Yu, that is. We should also get to him in a second. It's just absurd, right? Ferrari is just putting an axe on its foot. Apne pair pe kulhadi marna is the Hindi term, but it literally translates into just shooting yourself in your own foot. That's what's happening right now.
That's a good question, Samuel. And the other question to follow it up is, can they fix it, right? And this is where it's sort of getting very technical. I believe Ferrari will need to detune their engines as we at least approach Canada. It's too short to try and fix it. Just as I believe Mercedes need to fix their chassis. With Toto Wolff saying that even by raising the car, the porpoising and bouncing wouldn't stop. The truth is, they need to raise it probably even further. That's what at least a large number of people believe in the paddock. But maybe this is the right time to turn around and play our stats review by F1 stats guru Sundaram.
Welcome back, folks. And wow, it's always so much fun to listen to Sundaram. And the stats that he's got, so intriguing at all times. And I just want to discuss that a little bit further, Kunal. At the point that you mentioned about Mercedes, what if they just end up with a truck? I mean, later on in the season, like a proper Land Rover or something of sorts, because they come up with a car that's very high. But that discussion we shall get to in a second, because first up, we have to go to the eight sleep performers of the weekend. And that's something very interesting because I've got a completely wild range of picks, and for the first time, there's no one from the top of the grid to kind of talk about. Because as you mentioned, it barely was a race over there. But I just for a second want to talk about Zhou Guan Yu because in the middle of the race, he was also again another Ferrari-powered car that didn't quite have the opportunity to finish the race, but he was doing extremely well, mind you. He didn't quite outqualify Valtteri Bottas, but in all practice sessions, he looked a bit faster. Bottas was struggling with his car, which is a bit strange, but Zhou was very comfortably in the top 10. I mean, if anything, he could have ended up scoring a lot of points here today, maybe a couple at the max. So his race weekend was surprisingly different for a pay driver, which is, again, good to see, right? Good to see progress in a way.
In fact, Saumil, I have to correct you, and I don't blame you for getting this wrong, but it was the first time Joe Guan Yu uh, qualified ahead of Valtteri Bottas, right?
Ah,
And he did show some interesting pace out there, especially against Bottas, and seemed like the quicker Alfa Romeo driver, despite Baku being a Bottas circuit and all of that from his Mercedes days. So yes, I would say Zhou was definitely one of the drivers on the eight sleep performers of the race. It was unfortunate that he had a technical retirement again, and now he's just down to 1 point finish that he had in Bahrain at the start of the season. Did you just notice I said Australia because I've grown up in that era where Australia was always the first race of
yep.
the season. Yes. Yeah. But talking of Valtteri Bottas, it was only the second time in 8 races that he has not scored a point in a Grand Prix. So Bottas was just not there for some reason. But we have to talk about, I would say, I would put Sebastian Vettel clearly in that category because Sebastian, I can't remember when last I in the last couple of seasons have seen him be so racy. He was overtaking cars, which is great. He of course did a typical Sebastian, going off and spinning around, but that was a very quick reaction, another action, and then rejoining of the circuit. And he actually credited his rallying skills to him participating in the race of champions. And eventually we're all laughing about it, but he also said that had he not had that spin, he would have probably finished P5, which again is very credible given all the struggles he's had at the start of the season. Remember, he missed 2 races at the start, and then Aston Martin, of course, had a really bad car that they started the season off with as well. And P6 is their best performance together in 2022.
Yeah, and I suppose I would just give him extra points for being the eighth lead performer of the week just for that spin because at that point of the race we were kind of devoid of any sort of drama per se, and that turnaround was just fantastic, right? To see him do that, and you're right about that. How racy he was is very incredible to see how Aston Martin, in fact, they were just a lopsided team, right? Because Vettel was so racy at one point, qualified, I think P9, got into Q3 again, which is great for Aston Martin considering where they were early in the year. But it's just making me wonder, are we at that stage where Lance Stroll is genuinely costing Aston Martin badly now? Because we've seen that Vettel can drag a couple of good performances from this car. So I'm just wondering, the day Aston Martin are really very serious about winning a world championship, they'll probably not have him as their second driver. Not that he's terrible, but the difference was alarming per se.
You know what? I actually beg to differ because if it wasn't for Lance Stroll, Lawrence Stroll wouldn't have paid all that money to bail out Racing Point in the first
You're
place.
right.
So,
That's a good point. I actually forgot about that for a second. That, oh yeah, it's the owner. But yeah, I mean, objectively, if his real aim is to win a Formula One championship, I suppose the asterisks mean that winning it with his son. That's what he tries to say, but it's implicit, isn't it?
And let's remember, he said we're on a 5 year journey. This is year two of the 5 year journey. Let's see where all of that goes. But maybe, where Lawrence's money is also going is in building much stronger Formula One cars, given how his son Lance is, always knocking some part of the car around when he takes it out for a stroll. I mean, his was that a qualifying that he had that issue where he put his front wing in and then it didn't break, and then he said maybe I need to try harder, and then he just went into the wall because some sort of strength testing. I know we're not always a funny podcast, but that's the Inside Line F1 podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
I think they're kind of sponsored by JCB as well, the construction company. So maybe that's also one thing linking that maybe they want to try and be more sturdier, more harder, and try to break the car better and see how sturdy the Aston Martin can be. But yeah, wrong brand, mate. Probably that'll be better for something like a Tata in India. But that's enough on Lance Stroll, right? If we focus too much on him, I think we should also speak about other drivers who did really well. And Pierre Gasly was fantastic this weekend. What is it? P5 at the end. The way things were working out, it's just the best performance he's had all season long. And considering the bad luck he's been carrying around, I think this really could be the race that liberates him and opens up Alpha Tauri in both ways. And pun intended here because of Tsunoda's flippy rear wing and how that opened up only partially. But I hope that's not the case with their season right now.
Oh yes, absolutely. Pierre Gasly, even Yuki Tsunoda, they would have finished P5 and P6 had Tsunoda's rear wing not needed all that duct tape and stuff like that. Because I think both the Alpha Tauris drove a fantastic race in the end. In fact, Formula One's simulation had suggested that Alpha Tauri's race simulation was better than Mercedes, and they would have at least had one car finishing ahead of Mercedes. But yes, Pierre Gasly, I would say, and then Max Verstappen. I mean, they were discussing should we do 47.0 or 47.5. I mean, that's how relaxed he needed to be during the race. I mean, Sergio Perez outqualified him, outperformed him in every single session, but the main session when it mattered. But hey, all points down to Red Bull.
Indeed, yes. And after that, I suppose it'll be fun to discuss what happened in McLaren as well. Because in this race, it was really absurd that we saw Daniel Ricciardo not just be subservient to team orders, because he had a say this time out, because he was driving fast, which is firstly a good thing to see. Of course, he struggled at the end, as I mentioned, with the degradation, but he was a thorn in Lando Norris's side, which is, I think, something that McLaren would want to see more often, because this means that they got a double points finish, which was great. But what was this whole kerfuffle all about in the end, Kunal? About swapping positions, trying them out for one lap, bringing them back again, and they didn't end up swapping positions at the end. It's all just confusing what happened with McLaren. But at the end, what we can say is they kind of finished where their pace was, 8th and 9th. So fair deal. I mean, a decent weekend for them on the whole.
Especially considering that they started P11 and P12, finishing in the points was what the team said their target was, and they knew that it would be difficult to clear Fernando Alonso given Alpine's superior top line speed. But yes, I quite liked the team orders and the discussions they were having. And, for once, Daniel was being more gentlemanly, whereas Lando was trying to be the rebel out there. But I think in the end, the team played it fair because, in the first part, Ricardo sort of held himself back. And then in the second part, it was Lando, who was forced to hold back. And the question can be asked is, if they wouldn't have held Ricardo back, could they have gotten Fernando Alonso, right? And the truth is that at that point, they were trying to help Lando Norris overcut Fernando Alonso. So, they reacted for the moment, and maybe the team result would have been the same, just inverted with, Lando Norris being ahead of Ricardo. But I'm glad they played it fair, that because Ricardo held back, they asked Lando to hold back. And maybe they also know that, Ricardo just needs a couple of such results where he's backed by the team. He finishes ahead of Lando. He finishes in the points as well. And that sort of just fires the spark up in himself, because this was only the second time this season that Daniel Ricciardo actually ended up scoring a point, Sommel.
Which is surprising. That's not just not what we associate with Daniel Ricciardo, right? So Again, great to see him back in the points and great to see him happy at the end of the race. Of course, he was holding his back in pain, and that should be the next point we discuss. But for Ricciardo, great to see him doing what he's doing right now. I just hope that it kind of continues on onto a race like Canada, where, of course, he has performed so well previously. But that should be a discussion point in the race preview episode, which shall come later. What we should discuss immediately right now is the back issues, because, as I mentioned, Ricciardo was holding his back, but he was not the most notable name doing so. Lewis Hamilton complaining right in the middle of the race that he had back issues, and wow, the way he described it at the end was just proper hard and grueling stuff to see how he fought through at the end of it. But what's tough, Kunal, is that I don't think that Mercedes can find a fix. I mean, externally, they just have to fix it on their own, like kind of by raising their car, coming up with a different design. From the looks of things, there has been a bit of discussion about teams working together to maybe make the cars more comfortable. But I think the point remains, right? You can control the porpoising on your car. It's only that you have to sacrifice lap time for it. And I don't think Formula One should pass a regulation per se, but everyone needs to have a comfortable ride height, because essentially it's on how you adapt to it. Red Bull Racing are not facing the same issues, so why should Mercedes be rewarded for just being bad at managing their porpoising?
It's a very good question, Samuel. I think eventually it's going to be about the FIA stepping in to ensure driver safety and long term health. Because, yes, Lewis Hamilton was very, very evidently and visibly discomforted after the race. But, when you see through interviews or in the driver's pen, you saw somebody even like Daniel Ricciardo trying to, get himself a good twist in his back, and Pierre Gasly was asking around for a massage and the likes. At least that's what the stories are going by. But let's put it this way: different teams are experiencing different intensity of porpoising and car bouncing, but that it is being felt probably the worst by the Mercedes drivers, or at least they are the most vocal ones, right? Somebody like Christian Horner believes that teams are using drivers to pressurize the FIA into making changes. Well, that could also be true. Then there's this interview of Lando Norris doing the rounds where he said if Mercedes want to fix this, they should just raise the ride height of the car. And of course, Mercedes don't want to do that, because if they raise the ride height of the car, they're going to lose performance, and then they will no longer be in no man's land. They will be fighting in the super competitive midfield, right? So this is where the FIA might probably step in, and lots of Twitter threads doing the rounds about something called as vertical acceleration measurement, and then limiting how much of that can be achieved by any particular team through the weekend. So this will then hopefully level the playing field. But yes, then the question should also be asked that if Mercedes are the only ones facing such a big problem, why should the other teams sort of give away? Now, the unfortunate part in all of this, at least to my mind, is that the drivers are the ones who are paying with their health more than anything else. So any solution that is thought of, that is suggested, that is proposed, should be a driver first approach, Samuel.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard to see all the teams reaching a consensus with it, because at the end of the day, you do need a majority with this sort, and there are a few teams like Red Bull and like McLaren that aren't facing this with the same intensity. So I just hope that they are able to find a solution. But if anything, it just means that Mercedes need eight sleep the most. And if you don't know what eight sleep is all about, well, check out a special episode about sleep fitness on the Inside Line F1 podcast that came out a couple of weeks ago, and that shall give you a better idea of exactly what we're talking about right here. But the interesting part is pit stops, Kunal, because a lot of them were super slow. I mentioned Sergio Perez having a couple of slow pit stops. I think Lewis Hamilton also had one. It's just an absurd weekend on the whole in terms of pit stops per se.
I'm glad we're talking of pit stop, Samuel. And I'm reading out official data. The fastest pit stop was actually Alonso for Alpine. It was 2.74 seconds, which by Formula One standards is very, very slow. And to compare and contrast, in Monaco, Checo Perez had a 2.3-second pit stop, right? With a 2.7-second pit stop in Monaco, you'd only just make it into the top 10, right? But in Azerbaijan, McLaren, with a 3.6-second pit stop for Lando Norris, made it into the top 10. So clearly, there were issues that the teams were facing with their pit stop equipment and the heat. That is my simple assumption. And this is where I would also throw a lot of conspiracy theories out of the window that said that Red Bull purposely gave slower pit stops to Checo Perez to give Max Verstappen the advantageous position in the race, Samuel.
Yeah, when you're in the heat of the moment, that's what it feels like. Oh, they've called him not to fight. Oh, there's a slow pit stop. Come on, Red Bull, you're taking him away. But no, the truth is, Perez was not the faster driver. And in the end, you could say that the best driver and the best car won this weekend in Baku. But what's going to happen next time out in Canada is going to be the major question that we are going to answer on the Inside Line F1 podcast and Pitch the Podium in a couple of days, because we come out with the Canadian GP preview episode rather soon. So stay tuned for that. But I hope you enjoyed this episode, folks. And if you did, leave a like, share this podcast with your friends and family members, leave a good rating, and we shall see you in a couple of days. Bye bye. Have a good time.